So you can see that each time we've posted back to the server, it adds to the label text. But how can this be? HTTP, the web protocol, is a stateless protocol. Every time you post to a web server, it has no intrinsic recollection of previous pages or conversations with the client. So there's clearly something going on here which enables the page to remember what was in this control from the previous iteration so that it can add to it on the next iteration. This mechanism is called ViewState, and it's implemented quite seamlessly actually by ASP.NET, but it is quite important for you to understand exactly how ViewState works. So we're going to spend the next few minutes just looking at the ViewState mechanism and seeing how it fits into the page lifecycle. So we'll close the page here and take a look back in our default.aspx page and consider this mechanism now. Okay, so here's a slightly simplified summary of what happens the first time you request a web page from ASP.NET. There are 6 steps that we're going to look at here. I'm going to leave out a few page events which we'll come back to later, but at the moment, in this stage in our discussion, there are 6 steps we need to consider. To illustrate these points, we're going to run the application in the debugger, and we're going to set breakpoints on each of the methods to see what's happening. So let's switch to the code view. And let's set some breakpoints in our code. So let's go to the page load method and set a breakpoint on the first statement there. And also let's go down to our event handler and set a breakpoint in there as well. Very good. Let's run the application in the debugger. Start debugging. So this is the usual dialog box that pops up. We need to just click OK here to enable debugging in our web application. Okay, so it's hit the first breakpoint and it shows us that it's invoked the page load method to initialize the content of our web page. This is actually a little bit misleading because there's some initialization that's already happened before we get a chance to intervene. So let me just explain exactly what's gone on. When we visited the web page, ASP.NET created an instance of our web page class _default, and it created child controls inside my default class for each run at server that I have in my web page. So for example, if I view in design mode, we have a label and we have a text box and a list box and a few buttons and labels and so on. Each of these run at server controls will be represented by a .NET object which is a member of this class. Furthermore, these default values will be set according to the markup that ASP.NET sees in our web page. So for example, here we have a label, welcome label, and it has a text property, and the text property specifies some default initialization text for our control. So that's the first place where initialization takes place. ASP.NET will create a label object, and it will call the label object welcome label, and it will set the initial value to be enter your name and travel details for this year. And all of that happens before we get into the page load method. And to prove that, if I just put my cursor there and right click, if we go into quick watch, I'm going to watch for the expression welcome label. And you can see that it already contains the text enter your name, etc., etc., as per the static markup in the ASPX page. All of that has happened before we've entered the page load method. So clearly, if you have static initialization, the best place to put it is in the markup page. Nevertheless, situations do arise where you have to perform programmatic initialization, and that's why we have the page load method, of course. So in here, on the first visit, we set the country list, and then on every visit, we set the timestamp label. So if I just step over some of these statements, and I'll just stop there before going any further. At this point, we've reached the end of the page load method, and that concludes the initialization phase for the page object. After that's happened, ASP.NET will then invoke any event handlers that it needs to. Now, in this example at the moment, we haven't triggered any events. This is the first time the page has been visited. So we're not going to go into the button _click event handler this time through, although we will next time when we click the button. Okay, so event handlers would have been invoked if necessary. After that's happened, you can imagine that the state of all the controls in our web page, so for example the country list and the timestamp label, all of these controls will have the correct state that we want to send back to the client. So at this stage, the state of each control is stored in view state. Now the view state is just one big string really, and it gets sent back to the browser as a hidden input field. And that acts as a record of the state of the page as it was when ASP.NET returned it to the client. And you'll see why that's important when we think about what happens when the client posts back to us the next time. The view state is a snapshot of the original contents of the page. So this is what's happened then. The page load method has been fired. Event handlers didn't need to be processed on this occasion because this is the first visit to the web page. The state of each control has been sent back to the browser as view state. The next step is for each control in the page to render itself as HTML. So ASP.NET asks the page to render itself as HTML, and the page asks each of its child controls to render itself as HTML. So it's quite a recursive arrangement, and it's very powerful. It enables very complex hierarchies of controls to render themselves as HTML and to send that HTML back to the browser. So that's pretty much the end of the page object. It's initialized itself, it's handled events, it's rendered itself back as HTML to the browser, and so now ASP.NET releases the page object from memory, and all the server-side state is released. The only knowledge of the state of the page is in the client. This model gives great scalability. There is very little retention of data at the server, and this is quite critical if you want scalability for large-scale web applications with large numbers of users.